Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Real Faith in the Real World. Today, we're going to hear from Pastor Kathy King Nobles, co-pastor at Normal First United Methodist Church in Normal, Illinois, and retired pastor Harold Daughenbaugh. So let's listen to what they have to say as we continue our series on the book of Luke.
All right, I'm here with Howard Daughenbaugh, Reverend Howard Daughenbaugh. Many of you know Howard from through the years. I have admired Howard immensely for the many years I've gotten to know him, and I'm grateful that he's part of our congregation. So we're going to have a conversation today about Luke chapter 13 through 18 and anything else that Howard wants to share with me. So welcome, Howard. I'm going to invite you to tell us a little bit about your interest in the Gospel of Luke.
Well, my interest peaked at one point when I read a book the author of which and the title of which I can't remember at the moment, where he referred to Luke as the earthy gospel, and that intrigued me very much. And I have since then, in my own mind, tried to understand its earthiness. And there are a few of those items, probably more, but the ones that I think of right now is that it's interesting to me to note that in the nativity story in Luke, the reference is not to magi or the people with any particular wealth. And I think that fits with later comments in Luke in some of his parables about how difficult it is for the wealthy to enter into the kingdom of God, the realm of God. And anyway, he concentrates on the shepherds nearby and the nativity scene. Another interesting aspect about the sort of prefix to that is the stories of Zechariah and Elizabeth and Mary and Joseph. In essence, it seems as though the angel Gabriel, who visits Zechariah in the temple, and this is the same angel that visits Mary to make the announcement to her about her birth, about the birth of Jesus and her carrying Jesus. And but interesting about that, to me at any rate, is that in the story of Zechariah's encounter with Gabriel, where the announcement is that in their old age, he and Elizabeth are going to have a child who, of course, turns out to be John the Baptist. And Zechariah says, how can that be at our age? And the short version is that Gabriel responds to that by shutting Zechariah's mouth down.
That's true.
He can't talk until he confirms later on the name of the baby. Mary also raises a question of doubt about the announcement that Gabriel brings to her, but the response of Gabriel there seems to be totally different. He goes into a lengthy explanation as to what is happening there. And of course, Mary is stunned by all of this. But Gabriel must have interpreted that Zechariah was resisting what was going to be happening in their lives. And the angel must have realized that Mary, in her doubt, was also accepting what the message was for her. And shortly after that is followed the Magnificat, Mary's Song, which captivates another part of the theme of Luke's gospel for me and relates to the earthiness of the gospel, because she is referring to the powerful will be brought down and the hungry will be fed. And she just sort of, in that song, outlines the ministry and the message of the Gospel of Luke. Another aspect for me, aside from the parables that we may be talking about in a minute, which that theme crops up in Luke continuously for me, and that's one of the reasons why it's my favorite gospel. It is also the one of the four who, for the most part, seems to me to emphasize the prophetic ministry of Jesus. Although the pastoral ministry of Jesus is there clearly, but it is the prophetic ministry, because many of his healing stories, like the ones that are talked about in these chapters, are done on the Sabbath day, and in the minds of the Pharisees, that's a no-no.
Mm-hmm.
And he's using that to demonstrate, I think, that the message, the good news that Jesus is bringing to all of us relates to the fact it doesn't matter when or where or how the person in need is present. You always respond, you respond as best you can at the moment to the need. So Jesus is really living in the present much of this time, and not so much concerned about the legalities of what's going on. So that's another. Finally, I'll just mention, there are several others, but finally I'll just mention the story of the disciples on the road to Ephesus after Jesus has been crucified. I think I'm correct that story doesn't appear in the other Gospels. And in my mind, it's unique in at least two or three ways. Some of the other Gospels record that the disciples have gone back to fishing, and there's an encounter on the shore, and breakfast is provided. And I need to keep in mind that's another meal. Well, that figures in my mind, in the story to the disciples going to Ephesus. Why Ephesus? Interesting question. Somebody probably has got the answer to it, but why Ephesus? Anyway, they're getting out of Jerusalem because they don't want to get caught by the authorities and have the same thing happen to them that happened to Jesus. Same thing true for others, although it appears as though the women stay at Jerusalem. And Peter, if I'm remembering correctly, stays in Jerusalem also. And there may have been a couple of the others, but they go into hiding. The women don't go into hiding, but the guys go into hiding. And the women are the ones who are really present at the crucifixion more than the disciples. But anyway, they encounter this resurrected Christ, the risen Christ, on the road back to Ephesus, but they don't know it until they stop and they invite whoever this is to have dinner with them. And he comes in and he sits down and he has a meal with them. And as the meal begins, he breaks the bread, and that turns the light on. That turns the light on. And they realize who they're dealing with. And they are tremendously excited about that. And for me, one of the more important parts of that story is their decision at that point is not to continue their escape to Ephesus or wherever else. They turn around and go back to Jerusalem. Well, they go back to Jerusalem for at least two reasons. One is to tell their colleagues what they have experienced. But the second reason is Jerusalem at that time and in that part of the world was the city at the crossroads of everything. And it communicates to me at any rate that they're going back to Jerusalem is also got the intent attached to it that that's where they need to be to continue that ministry. Not in Ephesus or in these other places, whatever it might have been, but it's back to Jerusalem. And that is another aspect, another example, I think, of the earthiness of the gospel and why it's one of my favorite.
Well, let's continue that thread about Jerusalem, because I mentioned in one of my questions the section on the lament over Jerusalem and weeping over the children as they gather together. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. And then the psalmist writes, we pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and we think about all that's going on in the Holy Lands today, and Palestine, and the Palestinian people, and the Jewish people caught up in all of this, and the leaders making such consequential decisions. Can you reflect on that in like 2025 terms, and as we think about that?
It's a most interesting question, Kathy, and yes, I have sort of reflected upon that to some degree. I think one of the thoughts that I had is that first and foremost in the minds of most of Jesus's followers in that time that might be applicable now is that emphasis that is in this gospel about a caring for the outsiders and caring for the painful, caring for the vulnerable, caring for the suffering. Now, that sort of suggests that, in my mind, that what is happening to the Palestinians is terribly unjust and unfair, and I guess I think it is. At the same time, we got to remember why the state of Israel exists. I think we all know part of that story, at any rate, following the Second World War, the creation of the nation of Israel as a return to the homeland for the Jewish people who have suffered so much. And our son and his family have just returned from Krakow, where they spent a whole day at Auschwitz and Buchenwald. And they are still, I'll say just returned, they've been back about 10 days, and they are still processing what they saw and heard while they were there and learned. We won't get into that any more than that to say that it was clearly an experience that will live with them for probably the rest of their lives. So we got to remember why the nation of Israel exists. That doesn't mean we can't question the policies of the government of Israel. And so if we apply Luke's gospel and we apply the things like the story of the disciples returning to Jerusalem to that, my hunch of the matter is that they'd be questioning the leadership of Israel pretty strongly in these days, just as they questioned the ruling authority of the Romans in those early days. They would recognize they were all Jews themselves, and they were a part of the Jewish community in Jerusalem, and they would be recognizing that they are speaking to their own people, and that is what Luke attempts to convey to us in many different ways, it seems to me, that what Jesus was doing in reference, he was broadening the community, but he was referencing the fact of the people of his community hadn't fully understood the significance. They were placing their priorities where they shouldn't be in terms of the faith. And so Jesus was about widening that community, taking in the outcasts. Luke demonstrates to me in these stories and elsewhere that he's transcending, breaking down borders right and left. Well, that's some of my reflections on it. I could go on and on, but that's...
Well, I think about Luke broadening, his care and compassion for the poor, for the outcast, for women. So we're going to think about the role of women and Jesus's embrace and welcome of women, and I want to invite you to kind of reflect on that.
Yeah, we already talked about Mary a little bit about that, and we've already talked about the fact that in Luke's gospel, the women, Mary Magdalene and the others, stay in Jerusalem, and they don't go into hiding. It is sort of as if they have really picked up the mantle of Jesus's ministry. They're much quicker and faster and continue to engage with the people and the authorities, more so than the other male disciples. And they put themselves at risk. So I think that's another emphasis of in Luke's gospel that I'm not sure that we find elsewhere. The strength of that witness, at any rate. And without refreshing my memory enough, the story of Mary and Martha, which is very familiar to all of us, I think commonly that is what we concentrate upon there is what seems to be a kind of chastisement of which one is it?
Of Martha.
Martha.
Yeah. I know, I get it confused too.
And but I don't think that's what it is. I think Jesus is simply saying to the two women on that particular point that what you're doing, both of what you're doing, is important to the life and the meaning. Feeding people is crucially important, particularly those who are greatly in need. Talking about the faith and what it means for us is crucially important. We can't just sort of make assumptions about that. And so what the two women are doing there are exercising roles that in Jesus' mind were critical to life in the community.
Yeah.
And he's about, which is another thing that we need to mention, I think, is that Jesus had the desire to emphasize community.
Yeah.
Again and again and again. That's one of the examples there. And one of the ways, at any rate, that are very important about building community is dining together.
Absolutely. We know how to do that, don't we, as United Methodists? Well, would you comment a little bit on the parables? There's a lot of parables in Luke. And any that jump out at you, or kind of a higher level look at the parables?
And in reviewing those, one of the things that leaped out at me in reviewing these chapters, I had never caught this before, but there's twice that Jesus says to folks, you got to leave everything else behind. I had never had realized there were twice in these chapters where he makes a reference to that. Now, that sounds rather harsh. But what I think he's saying to us is, at that point, there has to be something in your life for which you're willing to give your life. And we have seen people over the years demonstrate that. And sometimes that means some of the people that are the dearest to you assume a secondary role, to what is being called of you and the witness that needs to be made to a world in chaos and in hurt and whatever else that makes life miserable for folks.
Yeah.
And so I think what he's saying is, look, that what I think, for me at any rate, he's not saying that your family is unimportant.
Uh-huh.
He's not saying that your good friends are unimportant. It's not saying that some of the other things that you're doing in the world for people is not important. He's saying that there comes that moment when a person needs to decide what's really going to define their lives. And so that's another part of these parables in this part of the Gospel of Luke that leaped out to me. And of course, this section is also the one that contains the story of the prodigal son.
Mm-hmm. That lost chapter.
Chapter, yeah. Which, again and again, that's another part of that emphasis that it is the lost among us that Jesus turns his attention to so very, very frequently. And it's no wonder he got in trouble.
Well, that's what I was thinking as I was preparing the sermon. I was thinking he's such a disruptor. He just disrupted everything, and of course it agitated people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's well, anyway, what's the thought that's going through my mind is that there's so many ways to interpret the message of the prodigal son. We tend to concentrate upon the prodigal, but there's the father and there's the elder son, and what that, it's easy to condemn the elder son for his response to his brother returning and what his brother has done. But on the other hand, I think I'd want to ask the question, is there any of us who wouldn't have a little bit of that response in us under the circumstances? I think his response is a very human response. And there's also the question, one can make the assumption in that story that the prodigal has gotten his life straightened out. But I'm not so sure we can make that assumption. It may be that he's just gone home to recharge his batteries. There is that prodigal in every one of us too.
Absolutely, yeah.
Carl Jung has referred to that as the shadow self. And we see the shadow self pretty clearly in the elder son, but we got to sort of dig it out in the prodigal. Take a second look at him. The father is a symbol of what it would seem like that he's trying to get his two boys to recognize that retribution is not the way to solve this relationship, that the way to solve the difficulty in the relationship is sitting down and being with one another.
Well, that's relevant for today.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, very much. And that reminds me of a story with my own father, but I'll not go into that.
Oh, okay. Well, basically, we could talk for hours.
We could.
And I would enjoy that, but I guess we need to wrap it up. Do you want to kind of pull anything together from the Gospel of Luke or your reflections?
I think I guess come back to something I said at the very beginning, as I recall, that the Gospel of Luke, I think, among the four Gospels, but particularly the Synoptic Gospels, the first three, sort of brings the whole story together. I'm probably wrong about this, but it seems to, and I know I am in the sense of some really good people who treasure the Gospel of Mark and Gospel of Matthew and all of them more so. But to me, there is, as I said earlier, Luke introduces to us that prophetic ministry of Jesus that doesn't get quite the emphasis in my mind in Mark and Matthew that it does. We've got to remember too that Luke is the gospel that was written, if I'm remembering that correctly, written later than the others. And what he's doing is bringing together for us a summary of the ministry of Jesus. He's using all kinds of resources that the first two Gospels did not use. Theirs were more like a personal experience. But Luke is trying to wrap all of that up together. And so for me, Luke and the book of Acts are the summations of the gospel story.
Well, thank you for your time, for your insights, your reflections, and always your wisdom. So grateful for you.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
You're very welcome.
Been good. I hope it's helpful.
We want to thank you for joining us today, and we hope you are blessed with this podcast. And remember that you are a blessing to everyone. Go in peace and have a fabulous week.